I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So citizenship is usually defined as a form of membership in a political and geographic community. T.H. Marshall, who is a well-known theorist of citizenship, was a well-known theorist of citizenship, begins with a definition of citizenship as a claim to be accepted as full members of the society. So nowadays, we usually think of citizenship as indicated by the passport you travel on or the country you were born in. Everyone in the world is a citizen of somewhere, except for a small number of people who are stateless. There are somewhere between 4 million and 10 million people in the world who are stateless, which means that they don't formally have citizenship in any country, and therefore they lack access to the rights and protections that citizenship can afford for you or can secure for you. So aside from stateless people, everyone in the world is a citizen of some country, and that's one way of thinking about citizenship. It's the formally recognized status of national membership in some country. But another way is as a category that is distinctive or particular to democracy. And here the distinction that I'm drawing is between citizen and subject. A subject is someone who lives under government rule but does not have any rights. Subjects are under the rule of a leader. The ruler can often command their subjects to do pretty much anything they want them to do. And so citizenship is a distinctive form of membership that's different from subjecthood. It's not just holding a passport, it's a form of belonging in which a person has rights that their government is obliged to uphold. So it's a relationship of belonging that grants members a particular set of entitlements and legal protections. Just as an aside, this book that's on the screen right now was written by Mahmoud Mamdani, who is the father of Zohran Mamdani, the mayor of New York City. So there are different types of citizenship. It's also a good book, by the way. There are different types of citizenship regimes. So a citizenship regime is a set of rules that defines who gets to be a citizenship. And some countries have citizenship regimes that depend on ancestry. So this is a set of rules that relies on the connection between the state and the nation. And by nation here, I'm meaning the ethnic character or identity of a country. So some citizenship regimes really focus on ethnicity as a basis of citizenship. So for example, Ireland, Italy, and Israel, all of these countries offer citizenship to people whose ancestors were Irish or Italian or Jewish, even if they were born somewhere else. So these countries are open to anyone in the world who is a member of the ethnic category that's associated with that state. And there are also countries that limit citizenship to members of their own ethnic group. So where citizenship is limited only to those who can establish their national ancestry or heritage. So the best known example of this used to be, until 1999, it was Germany. German citizenship was limited to people of German ancestry. So there were millions of people who had lived all their lives in Germany, whose parents or grandparents had moved to Germany, often as guest workers from Turkey in the 1960s. And so they'd lived in Germany for generations, but they were unable to attain German citizenship, no matter how many generations of their family had been born in Germany. This is also the case today in the United Arab Emirates. It's mostly true in South Korea and Japan. So this is, of course, a very exclusionary notion of what citizenship is and who should have access to it. So as the article lays out, Austria, Greece, and to some extent Switzerland also have this type of exclusionary conception of citizenship. The second regime of citizenship is called birthright citizenship. And that's basically the other end of the political spectrum, where countries give citizenship to anyone who is born in the country, even if their parents are not citizens. So Canada, for example, has birthright citizenship. So does the United States and Brazil. Actually, what you can see from this map is that almost all of the countries in the Americas have birthright citizenship. And then the other category that we're showing on this map is what they call mixed policy. So, you can get citizenship by family line and you can get citizenship by birthright, but both of them are going to be limited to some extent. Another route to citizenship that we're familiar with is immigration and naturalization. And most countries offer some path to citizenship to people who have moved there. So after a certain number of years of residency, or maybe through marriage, or as a result of employment or family reunification, you can become a citizen. And these countries have an idea of citizenship that we call civic, a civic conception of citizenship or civic citizenship. And that is when you don't have to be a member of a certain ethnic group. You just have to pledge allegiance to the country and you have to buy into their civic ideals. You have to abide by their constitution and their laws. You'll have to know something about their history. So, for example, I am not a Canadian. I'm American, but I could have become a citizen of Canada after living here for 3 years or after being a permanent resident for 3 years. At this point, I could become a citizen at any moment. Anytime I go through the process, I could become a citizen through the process of naturalization. It's also the case that more and more frequently, many parts of the world offer citizenship that you can basically pay for. You can get citizenship if you invest a certain amount of money in a country. And that's true in Portugal and Greece, and it's also true in Malta and Vanuatu. So, as you saw in the article that you read for today, political scientists argue that there are 4 component parts or dimensions to citizenship. There's legal status, there are rights, there are political and other forms of participation in society, and then finally, there is a sense of belonging. So we're going to go through these in a little detail. So the legal status is simply refers to who is entitled to hold the status of citizen. As we saw above, citizenship can arise by birth or naturalization or ancestry, and the legal status is just who gets to hold a passport, basically. In Canada, who gets to have a social insurance number. Rights are a dimension that establishes a relationship of obligation on the part of the state. So, to step back for a minute, people often talk about human rights as if they simply exist. People are always saying, I have a right to X, I have a right to Y. But rights actually only exist to the extent that someone or some entity secures and protects them. So rights really only exist if somebody is able and willing to protect those rights that you think you have, that we think we have. And most often, the institution that secures and protects a person's rights is the state that they belong to, the state in which they carry citizenship. So, in the day to day of our lives, our rights are most often protected in the country that we're living in. But this idea of rights protection and the role of the state becomes more clear in a case like the one of Brittany Griner, who was the famous American basketball player who was arrested for drug smuggling in Russia in 2022. And then the US government stepped in to negotiate Griner's release because the US has an obligation to protect the rights of their citizens. The Canadian government negotiated the release of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor after they were arrested in China in 2018. And again, that's because as Canadian citizens, they have rights. Their citizenship confers membership in a country that's obligated to protect those rights. More recently, in the fall of 2025, you have Canada putting pressure on Israel to release Canadian activists who were detained on one of the flotillas traveling to Gaza. Citizenship can also be active, as in something that is exercised through political participation and engagement in the governing practices of a society. So, citizenship can also be understood as political participation of the political participation in the governing of people within a territory. So I've mentioned before that children in school get civic education lessons from a very early age. And the point of this type of teaching is essentially to train young people to become citizens of their countries and of their societies. So this image is from a school lesson plan that's literally titled, the title of the lesson plan is Civic Participation for Our Youngest Citizens. And students learn that they exercise their citizenship by participating in the social and political life of the nation. So let me offer you an example. Students in high school are required to fulfill 40 hours of community service in order to graduate from high school. Some kids work at a food bank or a soup kitchen. They might volunteer at schools or at camps. But the point of that 40 hours of volunteer work is civic education. It's learning citizenship by actively being involved in the well-being of your community. And finally, there is citizenship as belonging. So this is the dimension of citizenship that appeals to people's emotions. It's citizenship as social cohesion, common language, common culture, shared beliefs, a shared political history. And children learn this too. They learn a feeling of connectedness to their own country in classes like history and literature, through morning rituals like singing the national anthem, and through experiences like Terry Fox Day, where everyone in the school gets out and walks or runs together, raising money for cancer and basically celebrating the life of a Canadian hero. And this kind of citizenship as belonging is often experienced as pride. People feel proud to be Canadian or Japanese or Peruvian. And so, as the reading says, states are not just legal and political institutions, they're also sources of cultural and social meaning. So, countries invoke or evoke emotional attachment. And then there's also a whole literature about how citizenship advances in waves from civil rights to political rights to social rights. In other words, historically, countries started out by protecting civil rights, the civil rights of their citizens. They protected the right to life, the right to private property, freedom of religion and association and speech. And then as they started to expand the franchise toward universal suffrage, citizenship started to include a right to vote and to have a voice in policy outcomes and to shape public discourse. And then finally, although not until the 20th century, you see a general rollout in the early democracies, a general rollout of social rights. So this is when many countries in the 20th century, around the time of World War I and World War II, after World War I, is when many countries started to develop social rights. And these are things like welfare benefits and old age pensions and child benefits and disability benefits and health care. So social rights are essentially what you're entitled to in the way of welfare as a citizen of a country. And in many ways, this is just a typology. It's just a way of disaggregating the components of citizenship, right? Like civil rights, political rights, and social rights are ways of disaggregating the component parts of citizenship. But it's not true that it necessarily works as first one. It doesn't always come along as first civil and then political and then social. And in fact, you can have one without the other two. You needn't have all of the component parts. And some of the things that come along with citizenship are often offered to permanent residents who are not citizens. So again, let's take me as an example. I'm a permanent resident of Canada. I'm not a citizen. And that means that I have civil rights and social rights, but I do not have political rights. So my freedoms are protected, things like freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. Those are all guaranteed and protected by the Canadian government. And I also have access to social benefits like Ontario public health benefits and education. I have a right to work. I have a right to a pension. I have a right to own property, and I have a right to enter into the country. My PR card gives me a right to entry, just in the same way that a Canadian passport gives that right to a Canadian. But what I can't do is I can't vote in elections. So I have civil rights and social rights, but no political rights as a permanent resident in Canada. And from here, we move on to a significant chunk of the reading, which is about multiculturalism and citizenship. And so, to explain this, I want to sort of think of citizenship as not really an object that we have or don't have, but more as a project, as the production of a sense of common purpose that allows a country to set common goals. Citizenship inculcates a sense of pride and responsibility. It's a common connection to a territory, a history, sometimes a culture and a language. And the Citizenship Project is about the rules and the frameworks that are going to help a country develop those feelings among their citizens. And the reason that a country wants to do that is because if people feel the sense of belonging to national identity and to a territory and to a history, then the country will be able to call on those people to do things on behalf of the country. So the rules around citizenship, who can be a citizen, how they can become a citizen, what are the benefits that come along with citizenship, all of this is about building the nation. And part of what is also about building the nation is establishing the boundaries of a nation. So who gets to be in and who is out. So what are the kinds of common goals that a country's citizenship regime can support? The most obvious is probably defending the country or going to war. So citizenship, for example, ties Ukrainians to Ukraine. It's what makes people willing to protect a country. Because after all, the idea of protecting a country is actually a pretty abstract idea. But people are willing to lay down their lives for the idea of a nation. And it's also what makes people willing to do more mundane things like paying their taxes or being willing to support a welfare system that's going to benefit other people in the country, even if they don't believe that it will ever benefit them or their own family. So, as we established above, some countries do this with an appeal to common language or culture or ethnicity, and this is called jus sanguinis, and that means right of blood. They limit citizenship to those with common ancestry. And the reason to do this might be something straightforward like racism. It might be that you don't want to extend the benefits of citizenship to people who aren't members of your ethnic or racial group. So we certainly see this now in the United States, where ICE and lots of ordinary citizens are targeting anyone who looks foreign, and they're eager to deport people who they think don't belong in their country. Because they're not real Americans. So instead of going after people who are in the country illegally or who are undocumented, they are just using profiles, racist and ethnic profiling, to go after people and arrest them and deport them. But another reason, so racism is one reason, and there are a lot of countries that are in fact very racist. But another reason to have a rule like this is that it's easier to have a common national project if your citizenship rules are restrictive. And if your citizens are all people who have, for example, German ancestry, or are co-ethnics, or if your citizens all speak the same language, if they all speak Korean, for example. So the most straightforward version of citizenship is the one in which there is a congruence or a correlation between the nation and the state. So in Poland, for example, 96% of the population is ethnically Polish. Almost everyone in Poland, almost all Polish citizens are actually ethnically Polish. More than 97% of the population of Japan is ethnically Japanese. More than 99% of the population of South Korea is ethnically Korean. But as it happens, there actually are not very many countries like that. There aren't very many countries where there is that kind of close relationship between the boundaries of the state and the boundaries of the population that's associated with that state. So many states, many countries include more than one ethnic group. So Britain, for example, includes the English and the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh. The Welsh. Spain includes Castilians and Basques and Catalans. Kenya has more than 40 indigenous ethnic groups. Nigeria has more than 250, and Indonesia has about 1,300 different ethnic groups. So for most countries in the world, the question of how to build allegiance and a sense of commonality, how to build allegiance to a country and a sense of common national identity in the absence of a common language or religion or culture or ancestry, that's a major concern, and it's a central political project. So that's why I say that citizenship can also be thought of as a political project. And traditionally, the way that traditionally that was done through exclusion or assimilation. So Canada, for example, excluded Indigenous people from full rights in citizenship for many years. And at the same time, it was working to assimilate them through the residential school system and through Indigenous status rules. Britain tried to assimilate the Scottish by suppressing Scottish language and culture. China is currently both excluding and assimilating the ethnic Uyghur and Tibetans. So China's newly drafted ethnic unity law, drafted in September of 2025, justifies minority repression and restricting language rights. And the headline here and this image from the China Daily newspaper explains the incentive behind this kind of political project to deliver social progress and prosperity. So we need ethnic unity for the purpose of delivering social progress and prosperity. So exclusion and assimilation are still robust and widely used strategies of transforming citizenship into a common national identity, but they're also anti-liberal. And the reason they're anti-liberal is because they involve excluding some populations from rights in citizenship. They fail to treat everyone equally, and they fail to guarantee universal rights. And these strategies are also anti-liberal because they restrict the rights of some people to religion, free speech, and so on. So the liberal solution is instead multiculturalism. The liberal solution to ethnic and linguistic and religious differences within the boundaries of a government, within the boundaries of a state, of a country, is to allow people to practice their own religion and culture, to speak their own language, and to live according to their own traditions. So liberal citizenship doesn't require this thick sameness of culture, ancestry, language, and belief. The idea is that it requires something thinner. Essentially, liberal citizens just need to buy into the civic commitments of the country. So in the United States and Canada, for example, you would have to be committed to core values like freedom and democracy and rights, but not necessarily to something like Christianity. So I want to take a moment here to use an example to illustrate this by talking about Quebec's Bill 21, which is a law that bans government employees from wearing religious symbols in their place of employment. So the law prohibits people like public school teachers, police officers, judges, and lawyers from wearing religious symbols such as kippas, hijabs, and niqabs, and crucifixes at work. So this is an example of Quebec imposing a thicker conception of citizenship. Quebec is saying it's not enough for immigrants to believe in rights and democracy. We want people who live in Quebec to assimilate to our way of doing things. We want them to adopt Quebecois practices and values, and to buttress Quebec language and culture, including a culture of secularism. So essentially, what's happening here is that on the one hand, Canada as a whole says we uphold a liberal conception of citizenship in which we allow and even support people in the full exercise and practice of their own culture, religion, and so forth. And Quebec says we want a different citizenship regime. We want a citizenship regime that supports a distinctive Quebecois identity. So one of the things that becomes clear in all of this is that immigration really complicates citizenship. And so a lot of countries limit immigration precisely for this reason. Their citizenship regime is based on a common heritage and culture, and so they do not accommodate immigrants from other cultures and races. And political scientists have done some research that gives us some idea of why or when this might matter. And what they've found is that people are more likely to support economic redistribution and the provision of welfare benefits if they feel a sense of common identity with the people who are benefiting from redistribution and from public goods. So it's politically easier to have generous welfare provision in countries that are more ethnically or racially homogeneous. And some countries are ethnically heterogeneous because the boundaries of the country were drawn around more than one ethnic group. So that's what I was referring to when I mentioned places like the UK and Spain and Indonesia and Nigeria. The boundaries of those countries were drawn to already include a lot of people who are living there who were not speaking the same language, following the same religion, and so on and so forth. But obviously, now, today, many other countries are ethnically heterogeneous as a result of immigration. So it's not just that the borders of the countries were drawn around different ethnic groups, it's also that a lot of members of different nationalities and ethnic groups have moved into countries or crossing borders all the time. So in the article that you read for today, the authors review the political science literature on citizenship and immigration, and a big concern of that literature is how immigrants integrate into a new population. And the main way in liberal states, the main way that they integrate socially, economically, and politically is through the practice of multiculturalism. So now let's talk a little bit about migration. Migration is the movement of people. And most migration that happens in the world is essentially invisible. Most people move from rural to urban areas in search of jobs or housing or a better life. And the reason I say it's invisible is because it's not registered anywhere. Nobody crosses a border. You don't have to apply to move from Hamilton to Toronto. You have freedom to move within a country, and most immigration happens that way. It's people moving inside a country. But what we're talking about today is migration across borders. And that kind of migration happens for a number of reasons. But most often, it happens because people are seeking better life chances. They're looking for employment, for safety, for better opportunities for their children, and so on. And most people don't move very far. They go to a neighboring country. So people in Malawi and Zimbabwe tend to go to South Africa, for example. About 20 million people a year migrate from Bangladesh across the border to India. And most people who live in Venezuela migrate to Colombia, which is right next door. So in 2024, there were about 304 million international migrants. And that's a large number, but it's also only 3.7% of the world's population. So that number has doubled since 1990, when there were only about 154 million migrants in the world. And on top of the 304 million migrants, the world also has about 44 million refugees and asylum seekers. Roughly 1/3 of all the world's migrants are in Europe. So about 94 million of the world's migrants are in Europe. And another third are in Asia. About 92 million are in Asia. North America has about 21%, and then parts of the world like Africa and Latin America have relatively small proportions of migrants. Both of them are under 10%. In terms of pure numbers, the United States has the largest immigrant population in the world in terms of countries. Those other bigger circles are regions. But in terms of countries, the United States has the largest immigrant population in the world. In 2025, there were 53 million foreign-born residents in the United States that were documented. And on top of that, an estimated 19 million undocumented immigrants. But other countries have a higher percentage of their population that is foreign-born. So in the United Arab Emirates, for example, 89% of the population is foreign-born. So only 11% of the people who live in the UAE are born there. Qatar and Kuwait also have immigrant populations that are over 70% of the total population. Australia is at about 30%, Canada is at 23%, and the US is at 16%. And then at the other end of the scale, we have a country like Cuba, where only 0.03% of the population is foreign born. So the literal number there is about 2,000 people. And then there's China, where only 0.07% of the resident population is foreign born. So with these numbers in mind, let's look again at the relationship between citizenship and immigration, specifically looking at immigrant integration. So let's take the UAE, where about 90% of the population are immigrants. Almost all of them are there on temporary work permits, and they have temporary residency. It's almost impossible to become a citizen of the UAE. Even many people who were born and raised there remain non-citizens all their lives. The same is true of Qatar, where roughly 88% of the population are non-citizens, and they have no path to citizenship. It's not like they're imminently going to become citizens. And the immigrant population of the UAE and Qatar are primarily migrant labor from India, Bangladesh, Egypt, and the Philippines. And actually, this is a great example of a country where the benefits of citizenship become very clear. So citizens of the UAE, and mind you, there are only about 330,000 people who are citizens of the UAE, but those people pay no personal income tax. They have access to free land, education, and health care. And they're entitled to government assistance for housing, for marriage, and for funerals. And this is basically also roughly the same story is true in Qatar and in a few other Gulf states. And this very robust set of benefits is not extended to non-citizens. So the division or the gulf between citizen and non-citizen is very stark in some parts of the world. Whereas, as I mentioned before, when I was using myself as an example, in Canada, the division between a permanent resident and a citizen is not that noticeable. A non-citizen like myself has access to almost everything that a Canadian citizen has. So in some countries, like the UAE and Qatar, the benefits or privileges of citizenship are extensive, huge, I would say. But it's not the same relationship that we talked about above. So Emirati and Qatari citizenship extend social and economic rights and privileges, but they don't extend civic and political rights. So the government of the UAE, for example, is a tribal autocracy. It's not an elected government. The general population, whether they're citizens or not, they don't vote. And they don't have rights to things like freedom of speech or association or opposition. And there's also no question of immigrant integration. Temporary workers occupy a permanent second-class status, and they have no route to entry. So one of the points you could make with respect to this article, one of the articles we read for today, one potential critique of this article is that it has a very narrow scope. It's about citizenship and immigration in the liberal societies of Europe and North America. But if we look at cases like Cuba and China, where there's almost no immigration, and places like Qatar and the UAE, where there is a shocking amount of immigration and yet zero integration and no route to citizenship. If we look at cases like these, one of the things that you can see immediately is just how distinctive and uncomparable the liberal Western cases are. So political science seems to be interested in citizenship and immigration in the very small handful of 20 to 30 liberal or mostly liberal countries out of the 200 or so countries that exist in the world. So to draw the comparison between Qatar and the UAE and these 20 mostly liberal democracies, let's again take a look at Canada. Canada is a country where the vast majority of immigrants are actually citizens. So 80% of all immigrants to Canada have become Canadian citizens. And then this number gets higher the longer a person has been in the country. So 94% of people who arrived before 2001 were citizens by 2021. In Australia, 59% of migrants are citizens. Even in the US, it's 49%. So these are all countries where there is a very robust path for immigrants to become citizens. Generally, the path is they arrive legally in the country, they have permanent residence status for a certain period of time, a certain number of years, and then they can apply to become citizens. So for the rest of the lecture, I'm going to focus our attention on immigration itself, on the movement of people across the globe. And the first thing that I want to show you here is migration routes. And that's the paths that people take on their journey to what they hope will be a better life. And some of these routes have been in operation for decades. So there's a so-called Eastern Mediterranean route where people cross through Turkey to get to the EU. This is a route that grew a lot more crowded after the outbreak of war in Syria in 2011. And then those Syrian routes also merged along the easternmost points below the Mediterranean Sea. They merged with an East African route, and that was mainly people fleeing conflict in places like Somalia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo and South Sudan. And then there's this Central American route that you can see here on the top map, the Central American route, which is mostly controlled by human traffickers and drug cartels. Many of the people who are traveling this route are fleeing gang violence related to the drug trade in Honduras, El Salvador, and Ecuador. They're fleeing political and economic collapse in Venezuela, ongoing violence in Colombia, climate-related collapse of the agricultural sectors in a few Central American countries, and violence and poverty in places like Guatemala and Mexico. But one of the things that's interesting here is actually some key recent changes in these long-term trends. So in the past year, there's been a surge in southbound flows along the Central American routes. So those Central American routes were always northbound. They weren't people going in both directions. They were people traveling north. But there's been a sharp decline in that over the last year. In Panama, for example, there was and Panama, of course, is a key sort of transit point. Everybody who's going from South America to North America has to go through Panama. In Panama, in 2024, there was a 98% drop in northbound travel. Guatemala reported that more than 70% of migrants were traveling through the country were traveling south. And those migrants were either returning home or they were changing their destination. And this is all almost completely a result of more restrictive policies at the US border. But something similar and surprising is also happening in Europe, where in 2024, we were already seeing declines in migration to Europe. And then that decline continued into the first half of 2025. Between January and April 2025, travel from West Africa dropped by 37%. And a lot of those people who would normally have traveled to Europe were now instead going to Libya. And then there are a lot of people in North Africa who engage in seasonal migration throughout the region. And then on the other hand, there's been an uptick in travel from Libya to Greece, and arrivals from Libya to Italy increased by 64% in the first half of 2025. So there's still a lot of movement. It's just that the nature of the movement and the direction of the movement has changed. Travel from Djibouti to the Arabian Peninsula, so from East Africa to countries like the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, went from about 17,000 in the first part of 2024 to 42,000 in the same period a year later. So that increased, people going from East Africa to Arab countries, but then returns from Yemen to Djibouti also rose by 45%. So partly what we're seeing is people actually moving cyclically now, instead of moving only in one direction. And I also want to focus here on another trend that's sort of underappreciated in the global north, and that is south-south migration. So traditionally, most global migration was from poor countries to wealthier countries. So the kind of pattern that we're familiar with, the kind of stories that we hear about migration are generally about people who are trying to reach Europe and North America. But in 2023, about 1/3 of all migration was between countries in the global south. And in 2025, that number is about half. About half of the world's migration is between countries in the global south. And about 80% of south-south migration is between neighboring countries. So that's between Zimbabwe and South Africa, or Venezuela and Colombia, or Bangladesh and India. So the largest south-south migration corridor is between South Asia and the Middle East. So this is that migration that I was referring to between or from India and Bangladesh to places like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE. There's also a lot of movement from Africa to the Middle East. After the United States and Germany, Saudi Arabia is the third largest immigrant destination country in the world. And this development of the Middle East becoming a major migration hub or destination That's one of the biggest migration pattern changes over the last 30 years. And beyond just looking at numbers and maps of how people move, there are four things that are interesting about migration in the world today. And the first has to do with remittances. So remittances is the money, remittances are the money that migrants send home to their families. And in many countries, remittances are a significant source of income. So in 2024, more than $900 billion went to low and middle income countries through remittances. Money sent through remittances is more than 3 times the global total of foreign aid. And experts estimate that worldwide, about 1 billion people are supported by remittances. So 1 billion people in the world are being supported by their family members who go to another country, make money, and send money home to support their families back home. That money is supporting about 1 billion people across the globe. And as you can see from this map, most remittances go from the global north to the global south. But you can also see that the Arab countries are an important and significant source of remittances. And although they don't show up on this map, what the growth in south-south migration generates is also a growth in remittances, or a growing web or a thickening web of remittances that are traveling. This is money that's traveling intra-regionally within the global south. So a second thing that's interesting is that a lot of south-south migration is temporary. So whereas people moving to Europe and North America often intend to stay, they plan to become citizens, they're going to put down roots and raise families of Canadian or Swedish or French children, people who are traveling to Qatar are never going to have more than temporary status. They are there for employment, and their intention generally is to return home. This is also true of Chinese migrants who go to work in Korea, and for people from Bangladesh who go to work in India. So for many people, migration is cyclical and circular, and amounts essentially to an employment cycle. It's less of a life plan than it is a labor plan. And a third thing, and this might be of particular interest to people who are interested in development, is that this thick web of labor migration generates an exchange of knowledge and skills and information and ideas that's traveling among countries of the global south, and particular in places of labor like factories and mines and oil fields, but also in the service sectors and so on. So this could hypothetically lead to a much more porous labor and economic boundaries. So you've got not just this sort of thickening web of money moving around in the global south, but also information, skills, knowledge, and ideas that are crossing borders more easily because human beings with those attributes are crossing those borders, and they're taking their information and their skills to the new places where they're going to work. And that could build new levels of economic and labor innovation and development in the global south. So migration, this kind of cyclical circular movement within the global south could be a real asset for development. And a fourth implication has to do with rights and politics. So I made reference earlier to the fact that people talk about rights as if they are universal and as if a person has rights simply because they are human beings. But that is a hypothetical view of rights. In fact, the only people who have rights are those whose rights will be protected by some entity. And the entity is normally a state. The entity is normally the country of which a person is a citizen. Although there are exceptions, of course, a lot of people who are citizens of a country have hypothetical rights that are not, in fact, upheld or protected by their country. So, leaving that aside, however, people who are migrants or who for many years of their lives are outside of their own country have no source of rights. Migrants who are traveling from one country to another with the expectation that they will gain citizenship in a new country, those people are moving from one rights regime to another. So they should, presumably, they're leaving this country, they're moving to that country, they're moving from one set of rights protection to another rights protection entity. But migrants who are temporary workers or whose lives are a near constant cycle of migration, those people are actually existing more and more in what we might think of as a rights vacuum. A permanent migrant or a temporary worker also has very few rights, sometimes no rights, and they also have very little scope or space or vocabulary for politics. They have no body or institution that is responsible for listening to their demands. So in most cases, they have no legal right or to even make demands. They have no voice or grammar in which they can make demands. They don't have any frame, to go back to our week on social movement theory. They don't have any frame in which to articulate their demands or with which to make their demands legitimate. So you have an increasingly large number of people. The fourth point that I'm making is that you have a larger number of people that are rightless, that are existing in a rights vacuum in the world as a result of the cyclical, the advance of a cyclical pattern of migration in the world. And I'm going to conclude this discussion of immigration with a focus on the impact of climate change. So that's essentially a look to the future of immigration. The Institute for Economics and Peace estimates that by 2050, up to 1.2 billion people will be forced from their homes as a result of global warming. And if climate change plays out the way we expect it to, it's going to lead to just a massive, unprecedented amount of human migration. And a lot of that migration will be what's called irregular. It will happen because of a crisis. It won't be planned. And it also won't follow established migration paths. It won't follow those routes that I showed you the maps of with which we're already familiar. A great deal of it will be internal. People will move from low-lying coastal areas to cities and to higher land. But it will also significantly increase regional migration between bordering countries. So if a hurricane hits the coast of northern Mozambique, for example, people will flee to Malawi. A lot of people whose homes have been destroyed by flooding in Bangladesh cross the border into India. So climate migration will become increasingly frequent, and it's going to have its biggest impact on the type of south-south migration that does not lead to taking up citizenship in another country. Another thing that's interesting about climate change migration is that it's generated a whole new politics, a novel set of political claims that we wouldn't have anticipated even as recently as 15 years ago. So when it comes to immigration, the types of claims that we're familiar with are about demands for entry. We live in a world where sovereign states have a right to control access, they can control their borders, and the social justice question is generally about who gets access, who has a right to enter, who has a right to stay. That's the kind of politics that's playing out right now in the United States. But climate change is generating a whole new politics of immigration that centers on what is called a right to stay. And this is a politics that's already well advanced in some Pacific Island countries like Tuvalu and Vanuatu, where islands are already becoming unlivable. So the right to stay is a demand. The right to stay is a demand that the world community invest in making their countries habitable. So when people demand a right to stay, what they're actually saying is, we demand that you make it possible for us to stay in our home. So this is a really interesting development in the sense that it's a politics that the world is unfamiliar. It's a set of political claims. It's a framework of politics that is brand new. It's a political claim that hasn't made before. And so I just want to leave you with this idea that new political claims are possible, that social justice demands that we are totally unfamiliar with are going to keep on evolving, that social justice demands evolve, and that they will evolve over the course of your lifetimes as people start to make different demands as a result of changing political, social, and geographical circumstances. So that's it for this week. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.